All right. Welcome, everyone. I want to first welcome everyone who is here physically in the room at USC tonight at Ground Zero Coffee Shop, and I want to welcome everyone who is watching us from their mobile devices and televisions at home via our video feed, and also those of you who are watching via the Facebook live streams from USC and via procon.org. Tonight we are so excited to bring you the second of 4 of our Procon at USC series. This is a partnership we have with the Jesse M. Unruh Institute of Politics here on the USC campus. Couldn't be more thrilled. This is an event series that has been sponsored through a generous donation from the Arthur N. Roop Foundation. And what we are trying to do is model civil discourse. We want to show not just this campus, not just Los Angeles, we want to show the nation and the world what it looks like to disagree without being disagreeable. That is the point of tonight's exchange, and we are thrilled to have a very esteemed panel here tonight, and we're very eager to hear their thoughts about why the middle class is declining and what we're going to do about it. To help facilitate that and to get some of your insights, we've set up some voting boards in the back where you can vote whether you're pro or con, whether more or less government involvement will be in the best interest of supporting the middle class. So please make sure you vote before and then vote again after so we can get your thoughts as well. Those totals will be summarized on the Procon website, and then you can see how we all did collectively. And if you can make it next week, we'll be back. The week after that, we'll be back. If you don't want to be on the USC campus, no problem. Come to the Santa Monica Pier. We're doing the same topics at the pier next week and the following week as well. Next week is going to be about the education system in Los Angeles, and the following week will be about housing crisis in Los Angeles. We're very excited to be partnering with USC, and with no further ado, I will hand over the mic to Miss Allie Bissonnette.
Yeah, thanks, Kami. Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for being here this evening. Allie Bissonnette, Deputy Director of the Unruh Institute, filling in for Bob Shrum this evening. So just want to do a quick reminder that next Tuesday we'll be here again in Ground Zero talking about public education in Los Angeles. Definitely a great event to come to. I will also give you a clue. It's Papa Christo's food, so don't miss the best Greek food in Los Angeles. I would also encourage you to RSVP if you haven't already for our new electorate conference on September 28th, where we're going to be talking about gender gaps, racial divides, and millennial voters, like many of yourselves. So RSVP on Eventbrite. It's on our Facebook page. I now have the pleasure of introducing tonight's moderator, who we are thrilled to have, Alex Cohen. She is a local host of NPR's Morning Edition on 89.3 KPCC, Southern California Public Radio. Yep, I listen every day, so I'm thrilled. And she previously hosted KPCC's Take Two and All Things Considered. So Alex, thank you for being here, and Alex will introduce our esteemed panel.
Thank you so much, Allie, and thank you all for coming out. I'm just going to very quickly run through who we have here on the stage and who we will most likely, I believe, have on the stage shortly. To my immediate right, David Hadley, a former California Assemblyman representing District 66, currently an Unruh Institute legislator in residence. Welcome, David. Sitting to his right, Silvia Barcellos, an economist with USC Dornsife Center for Economic and Social Research. Thank you, Silvia. And sitting to her right, Mike Gatto, another former California State Assemblyman representing District 43, another Unruh Institute legislator in residence, and he has a class tonight, so I especially want to thank after this. So thank you so much for taking the time out to do this. And as if on cue, Brian, amazing. Brian Calle, who's Vice President of Opinion and Commentary for the Southern California News Group. Welcome. Good to see you again. I just saw him last night on the pier talking about the same thing.
Hi, everybody.
So we're going to jump into this, and for the most part, I just want to give a heads up. We've got a lot of ground to cover, not a whole lot of time to do it. So for some of these questions, we'll hear from everybody. For others, we'll just pick one or two. We'll have some time at the end for everyone here to ask questions as well. But tonight, we're talking about, I feel like after we had the Justin Timberlake music coming into it, we should, instead of giving it the official title, it should be called Bringing sexy middle class back. Subtitle, should the federal government be involved in that? And so we're all on the same page, or hopefully close to it. I'd like to start off with a real quick lightning round definition of what you see as middle class. And I'll say last night, Brian, you and your fellow co-panelists were very cagey about this. So I'm going to instruct some rules here. This is like a tweet.
Facts and numbers.
140 characters less. Doesn't have to include facts or numbers, but how would you define middle class in America today is, David?
I don't say anything in 140 characters. Middle class is about meeting your basic needs, but also having the opportunity to pursue your aspirations, educational, professional, career. We work to live, but we also live to do a lot of other things. And middle class is both an economic concept and an aspirational concept.
Fair enough. Sylvia?
Well, as a researcher here in the panel, I'll go with the definition of the Pew Research Center study. So for them, middle class ranges from lower income in 2014, $44,000 to $144,000 for a family of four.
I love this woman already, providing actual concrete numbers. Thank you so much. No pressure. Mike Gatto with more numbers or more of an idea. How do you define
No
middle
numbers.
class?
Middle class to me means families that do not qualify for any type of governmental assistance, whether it's scholarships or some of the other government assistance, but they're also in a position where money is not something that they don't not have to worry about, if that makes sense. They're definitely not in a position where they are as secure as the ultra-wealthy, but they're also not in a position where anybody's helping them out.
Brian?
I agree with all three of them. And I would. And
you can rest it to see all of the above.
All of the above, I think, is actually good. I would add to that one thing, which is also retirement security. So when I think of the middle class, I think of my grandparents who both passed away now. But my grandfather was a union steward in a bakery, Vaughn's Bakery. And while they weren't living paycheck to paycheck, funds were still tight, but they could provide food. They could provide an occasional trip on the weekend for their family. But they could also know that when they retired, that they weren't going to have to worry about completely uprooting and changing their lives. So I think retirement security is part of that.
Sylvia Barcellos, because you did us the honor with the numbers before, I want to shoot this question to you. I mean, the question that we're talking about tonight kind of assumes at its core that the middle class is, in fact, disappearing. What do we know about that? How much is it disappearing? How long has it been disappearing for?
Right, that's an interesting question. And again, it depends very much on how we define the middle class, right? So for the definition that I gave you earlier, we have numbers like the medium income middle class household fell nearly 5% between 2000 and 2014. And if you look at wealth, as one would expect, the decline is even larger. So the wealth, which is assets minus debt, declined by 28% after the housing market crisis. For this middle class definition. Of course, if you go with other definitions, such as Emmanuel Saez's definition of middle class being someone who earns between the medium income in the U.S. and the 90th percentile of income, so that's a big number, this decline is actually much smaller, and in some groups it might actually have increased during the same period. So it all really depends on the group you're focusing on.
And this notion that it's disappearing, the assumption seems to be that that is not a good thing. One could play devil's advocate, Brian, and say, well, survival of the fittest, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, this is the American dream. Why should we be concerned about the middle class disappearing?
I think that part of the reason that the United States has had, and I would never make that argument and say the survival of the fittest thing, but I would say that many of the societal problems that we're feeling today, the social unrest, some of the angst, some of the blame pointing, some of the partisanship that we're seeing is a direct result of a shrinking middle class. Because when you have more and more people feel that they are unstable, they start looking to the people who they view to be stable or too stable, which is the ultra wealthy. And that's why we've seen over the last several years the rise of the narrative of the 1% versus the 99%, right? And more people are feeling as though they're part of the 99% because that middle is shrinking. The greatness of America was the greatness of our middle class, that so many people could achieve the American dream and be stable, have retirement security, have income, sustain their family, sustain their aspirations as David had. But when that starts to shrink, then you see a lot more of the angst, the anger, the violence, and the vitriol that we're seeing not only in modern day politics, but in some of our own communities. And so policymakers have to start thinking about how do we fix that, because that is, in my opinion, the core issue, the core problem that's causing most of the bigger issues that we're seeing in society today.
You said the P word, policymaker. So at this point,
I blame
David Hadley
these
and
two.
Mike Gatto. Not blame.
Everybody blames
We're
us.
not blaming anybody. But gentlemen, I'd like to turn to the two of you. When you were serving in the legislature, I mean, there are so many things, especially here in California, that you have to think about. The environment and education and healthcare, and the list goes on and on and on and on. How much were you thinking about the middle class, and what sense of responsibility or mission did you feel on that front? Mike, you want to start?
So I think we've been approaching this problem completely wrong. And this is an issue that I care greatly about, because this was sort of one of the reasons why I got involved in politics, was a shrinking middle class. And it's something I've studied and I've written extensively on and I've read a ton about. And I rapidly came to the conclusion that anybody who cares about this problem, is focusing too much on what I would call policy solutions, and they're not focusing enough on monetary solutions. I want you guys tonight to think about two families, and we all know families like this here in Los Angeles. Family number one is they own a large home. They've owned that piece of real estate for quite some time. They have a second home somewhere in the state, a vacation home. It could be a cabin in the mountains somewhere. They have a 401k and an extensive stock portfolio, and they also own a small apartment building, let's say 5 units somewhere, as a retirement security. Family number two is a renter, and they earn a salary, and that's their primary source of income is really their salary. They're a wage earner. The gap between rich and poor can be understood with 2 words, and that is monetary policy. When the Federal Reserve has done what it's done, which is engaged in this massive monetary printing for the last decade, we've printed $2 trillion. That, just to give you an idea of the size of it, the Federal Reserve has printed the entire state budget of California every year. That money, obviously, you're flooding the market with dollars. You guys know supply and demand. The value of a dollar goes down. The value of things priced in dollars, assets, stocks, and houses go up. One demographic owns stocks and houses, one demographic does not. And therein lies the gap between the rich and the poor. Almost everything that I've read indicates that this is the biggest problem. We, though, tend to focus on things like, what can the state of California do? The answer is, what we can all do, we can lobby the president to focus his or her appointees to the Federal Reserve to be people who are mindful of the gap between rich and poor.
David Hadley.
I'll come at it from a somewhat different direction. I think that the middle class wasn't created in a day or in a year. This was decades of work to create the American standard of living that we all aspire to now, making workers more productive, making them educated to earn a living, to meet a market need, to allow them to earn a good wage and save for retirement. So this really comes down to many policy basics about the cost of living, the cost of housing. I agree with Mike on the monetary level. We also have, totally separate from monetary issues, we have an unnecessary scarcity of housing in California, which has greatly benefited previous owners of housing stock. The cost of electricity and gas, the cost of healthcare, the cost of college, the cost of higher education. So all of those costs are what stand between a lower middle class income and a middle class wage. Our educational policy in California is not run for the benefit of students. It's run for the benefit of the special interests who control our education system and who extract billions of dollars a year from California taxpayers to provide substandard educations to far too many children in this state. And so when you make the cost of living high and when you create limited educational opportunities for millions of kids, both in California and around the country, you make it much harder than it needs to be to enter and to stay in the middle class.
I do want to talk about education, but before we do that, I want to talk about one way in which we've seen government on any number of levels, local, state, federal, get involved and try to make change, economic change, and that is a minimum wage. Some think this is the way to go, this is the way to save the middle class. Others couldn't disagree more. Is this the way to go? I'd like to throw it out. Who wants to jump in?
Well, I'm on record, so I'll start. I voted against the increase in the statewide minimum wage when I was in the state legislature. I will add another policy area which is complementary and I think much more effective. I supported the earned income tax credit in the legislature. We need to create work opportunities and we need to make sure work is rewarded. But the most important thing about a first job is the opportunity, the ladder of opportunity that it starts to create. We need to make sure that young people can enter the workforce, gain the skills to develop working class, middle class income standards. So I don't support the minimum wage that California has on a statewide level. I do support the earned income tax credit to make sure that low-income Californians, low-income Americans are earning somewhat much closer to middle-class wages, even when they're not productive enough to justify that in the marketplace.
And I'll jump in with my 2 cents, and hopefully it'll only be 3 sentences. So I voted for the minimum wage increases when I was in the state legislature. I view it as a Band-Aid on a patient that has been machine gunned like Sonny Corleone at the toll plaza. Raising salaries of the lowest income earners from $24,000 a year to $27,000 a year, when the people who own 3 or 4 houses have seen a 30 or 40% gain in the value of their houses because of our monetary policy, you're not going to bridge the gap that way.
Right, and if I might jump in, so if you think also in terms of just pure economic theory, it's some people will, with minimum wage, some people will lose and some people will gain, right? So it's great if you have a job and if you keep your job and now you're earning more, you're gaining, but it will actually be people who lose their jobs because of increases in minimum wage. So it's as very often a policy that will benefit some to the extent of others. So.
And I feel as if minimum wage is in many ways old school, right? This is a theory, an idea that has been tested and successes and failures we've seen over the years. We are living in a very new school era. And when you look at all of the technological advances that we're seeing right now as we live and breathe, and all of those that we know aren't that far down the road, automated cars driving us around so that we can work in our car or not have to think about driving, what have you. How do you see technology and future ideas affecting the state of the middle class? And Brian, I didn't let you talk about minimum wage tonight because I heard you talk about it a whole lot last night, so I'll let you start.
There's a record online of it. It was very bad. I think that technology plays a huge role here in the discussion about the future of our economy, and I think that that's why policymakers need to get ahead of the technological revolution. There's a lot of concern, I think. I mean, let's use Uber as the perfect example. I'm a big proponent of Uber, have been a big proponent since day one. I wish I would have invested because I'd be real rich right now. But Uber has so many drivers who I Ubered over here actually tonight, and they use this as a primary force in their income, right? And they're so worried that what's going to happen in 3, 5, 10 years when most of those driving jobs for Uber go away because of the automated cars that you're talking about. So the challenge.
But then they'd know how the taxi cab drivers today feel.
Yeah, this is true. This is true. And does that mean that we start to say, stifle innovation? No, I don't think so. I think that it comes to David's point that we need to re-educate our workforce so that people are ready for these high-tech jobs. I also think it means that we have to completely uproot and change our definition of what a job is, what work life is, and what our labor policies are, right? The labor laws that we have at the federal level and at the state level in California are all predicated on this idea that not even our parents really, but our grandparents lived, right? Which was this idea that you get one job, you're there for 40 years, you retire with a pension, you have your house paid off, and you have a dignity in your retirement years. That's not the way the world works right now. I am a full-time professor at Chapman University. Sorry guys, I'm a Trojan, but I'm a Panther now too. I run 11 newspapers and I do a bunch of other side studies for other academic organizations. I'm one example, but I have many friends who drive Uber. They also drive Lyft. They might do Postmates, and they have a bunch of other different jobs because of the gig economy. And I think that our labor laws need to catch up with the times to help and create an environment where that's the new way we have a workforce. And we're not quite there yet.
just to add something real quick. So I was a history major. You can read books written about the reign of the Emperor Vespasian in Rome in the year 70 AD, where they are talking about technology supplanting workers. You can read the same books from the 1600s talking about how technology is going to supplant workers. I might be an extremist on this, but I don't think it's going to happen. It has never happened. The workforce changes. There's a lot more people in service professions now than have ever been. 70 years ago, nobody got massages. Very few people had accountants. Nobody had a lawyer. A lot of people built their own houses. But nowadays you hire somebody else to do those things. And I think the workforce will change, but I don't think we will ever have a situation where technology supplants jobs. I think that's an illusion, and I think it always has been.
Right, but I think also that that's definitely true, but we need to think of re-educating and what's the role of the university in this sense, right? Because we do know that jobs that are more routine, they're more that can be supplanted by machines are being. So it's really how do we prepare the students for the world today? It's really about giving them skills that complement technology and not that are substituted by technology. So more than ever, we need to teach them how to think and how to learn for themselves and not only that content or that specific skill.
And to bring it back to our central question here, which is what is the role of government involvement, I'd like to bring up the R word of regulation. And David, I'll let you take first crack at it. I mean,
great, give that to the Republican. He's going to smack this one out of the park.
And I'll let the rest of you get to it afterwards. But, this is a big question. When we see these wide open landscapes where there aren't a whole lot of rules and regulations, be it Uber at the airport or people renting out their homes through Airbnb, what role should the government have in terms of regulating to make sure that the middle class doesn't, in fact, stay intact?
Well, I'm not sure the government is capable of regulating those things with that goal in mind. I think that we have to look at fairness and what government is capable of doing. If you look at cities and counties around California, Airbnb, Uber, and Lyft are actually fairly highly regulated. I'm sure many of you have flown in and out of LAX or other LA area airports, and this is not some Wild West. Airbnb has signed agreements with the city of LA, with smaller cities around LA, rest of the country. So I think the myth of this regulatory Wild West isn't quite right. Government does do a lot from a regulatory standpoint, some of which we need, some of which we don't. I think relative to the discussion topic tonight around the middle class, probably the biggest single area where the government directly impedes job, wealth creation, and middle class opportunity is in occupational licensing, and in far too many fields, vested interests have used occupational licensing to keep new entrants out of markets that don't need the kind of regulation. I mean, you want your heart surgeon to be, state board certified. You may not feel quite the same about your manicurist or your interior designer, but those professions are subject to occupational licensing in California and in many other states. So the government does a lot in California, in my experience. A lot of it is done not with your interests at heart, the public good at heart. It is done with very specific interests in Sacramento who stand to benefit from those programs. And I think we need to be very measured about what we can't regulate our way to middle class opportunity. That comes from skills, training, and a functioning economy. We do need to regulate for public safety, for fraud, and for consumer protection and privacy.
Mike, I want to let you weigh in on this, especially because it seems when it comes to government involvement in creating any sort of rules or regulations that might help the middle class, that sometimes you must be stuck between a rock and a hard place. Take, for example, Airbnb and VRBO. You hear from plenty of people in this town. elderly people not working anymore says, hey, look, I can rent out a room in my house, and this is the only way I'm going to pay my rent. You've got to let me do this. And then you've got the hotels saying, well, if everybody's doing this, no one's staying in our hotels, and we can't pay our cooks and our housekeepers and our concierges. It's almost as if you can't win.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if you can't win. There's an old saying in politics: lead, follow, or get out of the way. And I agree with David. I don't think government's going to lead. We're not going to be the driver behind technological innovation, and we're not going to be, in front of all these new exciting changes to the economy. I also don't think that we will follow. I think California has been a state that has a long tradition of regulating a lot of these new industries, even though we're the home of Silicon Valley, and we're a place that has a lot of these technological innovations. We don't typically follow whatever they want. We have our own opinion of what we want to do, and we often do it. The best hope we could have for government is to simply get out of the way. Maybe let these things take their course, let the market, and I know this sounds revolutionary for a Democrat to be saying this.
I just want to point that out for the record here.
Some people might sound shocked, but I think that, with innovations that are happening so fast, and with trying to find that right balance, it's often better to sort of find market equilibrium and let the forces take things where they may.
Way too much agreement happening between the two of you. This is supposed to be about heated discussion and dialogue. So
we'll get there. Wait till we talk about housing.
Right, so let's talk about, we could go housing. I'm going to go with unions for a moment, because this is one of the topics we didn't get to last night. And pretty much at the same time that we've seen the declining rates that Silvia's talked about in regards to the shrinking middle class, we've also seen a real decline in the presence and the power of labor unions in this country. So Silvia, let's start with you. What effect do you think that that's having?
Right. I think it's in terms of what's the effect of unions on the middle class. It's a bit hard to empirically pin that out, right? So there's so many things that are changing in the same time. You're right. Of course, manufacturing jobs where these unions were very common are going down over the same time period. So is it the effect of unions themselves, or is it the effect of this jobs disappearing of technology itself? So it's very hard for me to think that like a comeback of unions would actually help the middle class. At least I think we don't have concrete evidence that would be the case. Right now, with the type of technological advances that we've been talking about and the kind of job changes that we've been talking about, it would be much harder for workers to unionize, because now that each worker is doing something much different than their co-workers. So they're much less homogeneous in a sense. So in my view, unions might not be the way to go.
Okay, now I can jump in and earn my Democratic stripes back. There's a bumper sticker that you see on a few cars every once in a while, and it says, unions, the people who brought you the weekend. And that's really true.
The band, The Weekend?
No. The Weekend, and things like child labor laws, and an 8-hour workday, and a lunch break. These are things that unions fought for and secured in the earlier part of last century. And there's no way we could sit here and argue that unions did not make life just immeasurably better for so many different workers throughout American history. And I also think now that they play a very, very strong role in making what is left of the middle class still exist. Union jobs are good jobs. They pay well. And it really just comes down to raw economic power. On one side, you have a powerful company with powerful lobbyists and a whole lot of economic power. On the other side, you have all the workers banding together to get some of that power back in negotiations. That's all a union is. But that power is tremendous. And if you ever have an opportunity to join a union, I strongly suggest you do so.
Brian either ate a lemon or strongly disagrees. I'm going to go with the latter.
Well, no. I mean, I value unions. I think that there was a point in American history that unions provided much needed protections for workers. I think there's a really important distinction to be made between private sector unions and public sector unions. So I'm very much in support of private sector unions. I think they do good work. I think they're important, and I have the utmost respect. But I also live in California. where the strongest political force, and you can name all the corporations that you want, Mr. Gatto, but we know that the top spender on politics in the state of California is the California Teachers Association. And so unions are so powerful in the public sector here, they can get anything they want passed mostly, or they can block anything that they want. And I think that's a real problem that we've seen in California. And the best example that I could give is education. If unions are doing so much to help the middle class and the lower class, the first thing that they would do is fix our education system. In California, we spend among the most on education, yet we are 48th in the country. And the California Teachers Association is the most powerful union in the state and probably, frankly, in the country. So for me, until they put the kids in the middle class ahead of politics, I can't say that I'm a strong supporter of public sector unions in California or nationally. Private sector unions, I think, absolutely valuable, but politics and political power seems more important to public sector unions in California, and it kills me because the kids are the ones who are suffering. And I don't say that as like a talking point for everyone to say, oh, he's so compassionate, or what an asshole he's. I said that. There's a camera. Oops, my bad. But I say that because I'm someone who grew up in the public education system, who grew up really poor, who grew up in a really poor community with horrible schools, whose mother had to forge a utility bill to get me into a rich school district. So for me, it's really personal. So yes, we're going to have some fireworks over unions because I think there is some value in the history of this country with private sector unions, but I think that public sector unions have taken many aspects of our state in the wrong direction. And I would love to see the day that you and some others stand up to the union and say, we're with you, but you need to be with the kids first, and you need to be with the middle class first. Let's put politics aside and do what's right.
Would you like to respond, Mr. Gatto?
You should.
I mean, look, my political career was very complicated. I'm not going to bore people with, I mean, look, when I was first running, there were public sector unions that spent a lot of money dressing me up in clown suits, in 21 mailers to my district. And my crime was that I was not a member of the key public sector union where one of my opponents was. Now, I've had no problem. I think you can tell with my personality, I've had no problem telling it like it is and standing up when I think a union is wrong. But the question was, do unions, are they by and large good for the middle class, or are they bad for the middle class? And I think, I mean, anybody who's studied history in the last 100 years would conclude that they are good for the middle class.
Okay, we could talk about this all night, but we are getting to our last 10 minutes before we turn to the audience. And I do want to try to squeeze in if we can, because there were two topics that have been mentioned so far, and I think that they're both really important, education and housing. And since we were just talking about education, let's stick with that, but especially given the venue that we're here tonight and the audience we have, let's especially talk about the cost of a college education right now and the impact that that is having on our middle class, and to what extent, if at all, the government should get involved. David Hadley, let's start with you.
Well, first of all, I want to give all the college students here some good news, which is that statistically, and I don't say this as a cop-out for government action or inaction, but statistically, if you graduate from high school, do not have a child before you're married, and do not get convicted of a felony, you will make the middle class in America. That is a statistical truth for the overwhelming majority of people who are born in this country.
So no felonies, folks.
So no felony, well, that's not. Having said that, when we speak about everything from retirement security, as Brian mentioned, to having the ability to meet your aspirations, as I was talking about earlier, college is a critical part of that. And we have made college unbelievably expensive. And it's a very complicated thing because on the one hand, state legislators, we could pop off about, state institutions like, UCLA or Berkeley or what have you, but obviously we're not governing USC and private institutions. So there are broad social forces at work, everything from parents wanting the best for their children to the point that college standard of livings for many people are higher than they will be for 10 years after you graduate from college. Just walking around USC makes me want to go back to college. To in the public sector, not so much in the private sector, union power as well in the educational system. And that shows up in everything, excuse me for the faculty in the room, shows up for everything from teaching loads to the ratio of teaching to non-teaching professionals on college campuses. In economics, the price of something and the cost of something are two different things. In politics, we frequently fudge those, but in the higher education setting, the cost of education is out of control. I think there are only so many things that the government can do about it when you see that this is a phenomenon that affects both public and private institutions. But it has reached a point where I think that it is not premature to consider some radical things about the endowments and the tax deductibility preferences of institutions. I mean, Harvard is a hedge fund with an education business on the side, and that should be run for the benefit of the public, not for the benefit of of just racking up the largest sum of money that you possibly can.
Brian, you're champing at the bit here.
Yeah, so that's blasphemy at USC because we raise a lot of money here too. But I think a $6 billion capital campaign that just happened. But I would actually disagree with that. I don't think that's the problem. And this is actually really funny because this is where I'm a super centrist. As those of you in the room, a couple of you know me, I'm super progressive when it comes to social issues and pretty conservative when it comes to economic issues. But this is one issue where we want to talk a lot about the student loan crisis and how we address that and whether it's loan forgiveness and all those things. I don't think that's obviously a problem that needs to be addressed, but that's not addressing the cause of the problem. And the cause, I think, is subsidies, most certainly, and also the cost of education. And this is where I become super radical and propose on the left and propose price caps, because one thing that I think we all forget is that almost every single institution in this country, higher education institution in this country, besides a few, like Hillsdale College and a few who completely reject funding from the government, get some form of federal funding, whether it's in grants or loans for students or whatever it is. And I think if the federal government is going to use tax dollars that belong to everyone in this country, that they have the opportunity and probably the obligation to cap the cost of any schools that are taking those dollars. And there's obviously some ways that this has to be worked out, but I think we have to start talking about what is being paid for education, especially if there is higher education institutions being subsidized, and that's essentially every single one.
Mike.
So I think higher ed is one of the places where you can most profoundly see the gap or the shrinking middle class, and also the difference between rich and poor. At the beginning we heard a statistic that if you're making $120,000 in Los Angeles family of four, you're considered middle class. But if you think about it, that family that's making $120,000, you all know students here, right? You know students here who are extremely wealthy, and their parents can easily write a check for their education here or at any school in the country, for their room and board, for everything. And it's no sweat off their back. It's like me taking $5 out of my pocket. And on the other end, you know students here who are very poor, and they have a full ride paid for by either the state of California or by this institution. But of course, it's that middle class, right? You're not going to get any sympathy if you're middle class. If you're making $120,000 a year, you're not going to get any sympathy. Yet you, the middle class, that family is the one who has to go into debt or has to really, really struggle to pay for an education. So this is the most important issue, or it should be one of the most important issues. I'll tell you another quick anecdote, and I'll tell you my solution. I have a couple that lives in Hamburg, Germany. The wife is the manager of a real estate investment trust. They own properties all over Europe. She manages properties in Spain and England and Germany, everywhere. She went to college, everything like that. Her husband is a Lufthansa mechanic. He did not go to college. Guess who makes more? Now, in our country, that would never be the case. The husband who's a Lufthansa mechanic would never make more. But in other countries, they send a percentage of their students down other paths to get real hardcore training to get the jobs like fixing aircraft engines that pay really, really well. And they don't tell all their students this myth, which is go to college, get a master's degree, you will make it with that. Because I think that's increasingly a myth. I think that if a college diploma becomes the equivalent of a high school diploma, and everybody has one, then we're just going to be putting off the time that it takes for someone to become a productive member of society. So we have been sold a bill of goods to some degree in this country, which is we are training students for impractical jobs rather than the practical jobs, and we're telling them that there is no dignity in those other jobs. And I think we've got to change that if we're going to change things.
I don't disagree that education is absolutely crucial in this day and age, but if you do not have a roof over your head, you're going to be pretty miserable if you have a master's or if you have nothing. And as we all know, California right now, especially Southern California right now, really struggling with this issue of housing. We just have a few minutes left on the clock. So Silvia, I'm going to let you take first crack, and perhaps only crack on this one, about how housing factors into all of this when it comes to looking at the middle class.
Well, I think I'm not really I think you guys will have much more to say about this than I will. I think, yeah. So I'll let you guys talk.
Real quick, so I actually wrote an op-ed on this. It's appearing in the Los Angeles Times tomorrow morning. Please read it. It's 10 principles that inform the housing debate. I do go back to what I said at the beginning, which is if you're printing lots and lots and lots of money and the value of dollars are going down and the value of assets are going up, that's the point of quantitative easing. Housing is going to continue to be expensive. Here's a quick thing on subsidies, because affordable housing is a buzzword. Los Angeles needs 30,000 units a year just in this city for the poorest of the poor, the most affordable class of housing. 30,000 units alone in the city of Los Angeles every year. The average subsidy for a unit is $357,000. Do that math. That's the entire state budget for the city of Los Angeles every year. We are not going to subsidize our way out of this crisis.
And next time you want to publish an op-ed, I have 11 other better papers than the LA Times, just so we're clear. I had to say that. So I would also add that part of the reason that you have a housing cost issue in California is supply and demand. We've, unfortunately made it very difficult to build in California in a slow process with some of our laws, including CEQA, which needs to be modernized. If you build more housing, housing costs come down. And one of the ways in which we solve this crisis is to build more housing. We're seeing that a little bit in Los Angeles, not enough. We're seeing a little bit in Orange County, not enough. But the entire state needs it. You're seeing groups funded by techies in the Bay Area come out that are YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard, which are meant to help the state of California realize that we need to build more housing to help bring the cost down. And there's not enough of a movement for that. But I think once we do, it's not a silver bullet, and I don't think there is. But I think that if you build more supply, you can bring costs down. And then you couple that with creative affordable housing policies that actually are meant to help people into their first home, as opposed to just get more fees for the state coffers. And then you have a winning solution. But the solution has to start with, how do we build more? How do we build sustainably? And how do we streamline that process?
I want to turn it over to our audience now. We have some time for Q&A, and I really want to put focus on that first letter, Q. I know a lot of people in this room, not just our four panelists, have opinions, so please be sure if you have a particular panelist you'd like to hear from, let us know who that is, but most importantly, make sure that what you're saying is a question and not a statement. And let's see. I think we've got, yep, right
and we were having a hard time seeing you too. So.
Yes, but we will hear you because we've got microphones.
Flashing
hi, my name's Luke Phillips. I promised that I would save the hard questions for David. So, David, you can take this, but anybody who wants to. Where does energy fit in on this? I mean, California has some of the highest energy costs in the country, if I'm not mistaken, and it also has some interesting programs going on with energy policy as well. So I was wondering if you guys could speak a little bit to where energy of any sort, alternative fuels, oil, nuclear, fits into the question of middle-class status.
Well, somebody just dimmed the lights in honor of the energy question, and so we
look a lot better.
Yeah, and probably us too. Huge topic. I'll just say a couple of things. One is that nationally, not so much in California, but nationally, the energy sector has been a source of some of the highest paying jobs in the country that don't require master's degrees and PhDs in computer science. It has been a real bright spot in the national economy that California has taken advantage of, but only to a limited degree. The cost of electricity, the cost of energy is higher in California than it should be. I have notwithstanding my Republican stripes, I'm I both come from a district and I have a lot of strong environmental views myself. Most of the cost premium in California for energy is theoretically for environmental reasons, some of which are valid, some of which are not. I personally think that if we are going to increase the cost to consumers for energy to meet environmental goals, that may be justified in some cases, but we should recognize it is virtually the most regressive tax that we can impose on Californians. And the right way to use the money that comes from that is not Sacramento pork barrel spending, which is not designed mostly to clean up the environment. The use of that should be to reduce the sales tax, which is the other most regressive tax in the state. So I think we can achieve our environmental goals. We may not lower energy costs as much as I'd like them to, but we can offset that with lower taxes on other consumer products.
So a couple years ago, I met with some executives in Silicon Valley, and I pulled out my iPhone and I said, this was designed here, your company is headquartered here, your executives all live here. Is there a reason why you can't make these here? And I expected them to say wages. I expected them to say, well, we'd have to pay an American worker $20 an hour, and where we manufacture these, we pay someone $5 a day. But they said wages are not the biggest factor in manufacturing something like that. We can actually make that up with all the other costs. There's quality issues, there's shipping issues, there's all sorts of different issues. They said the biggest factor why we can't have manufacturing jobs in California is the cost of energy. So it's food for thought. I mean, we obviously want to have very strong environmental policies, but the energy costs, very good question. It does play a role in the quality of jobs in California.
And let's take another question. We have a gentleman here on the couch.
Hi, yes, Stephen Hubbard, Soul Price School. I'm just graduated from the professional doctorate program there. So between 2000 and 2008, 42,400 factories closed across the United States, and about 6 million manufacturing jobs were lost. And then a post-analysis of that revealed that about 85% of those jobs, those were all offshored, would actually have lost over the same period through automation. So my question is when you look at automation and offshoring, destroying jobs and hollowing out the middle class, what levers do you have to change those? Because I don't see the fiscal policy, I don't see minimum wage solving that, I don't see subsidies, taxes, or anything solving the problem of basically machines and people in other countries doing the work that used to be done here. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure I would say this is a issue to be solved, or how do we bring those if it's even desirable to bring these jobs back, right? So if we think of like trade and trade theory, it's again some winners, some losers. People whose job go abroad, they're definitely losing, especially if they can't be retrained and move into other industries. But there's also prices of goods that everyone now here pays, they're lower, right? And we can talk about what the right tariffs should be, what the right import-export tariffs should be, but trying to close ourselves to trade, I don't think that's the right way to go.
Absolutely. I would say a couple of things. I would go back to something I said earlier, which is the gig economy. I think that we have to start looking at workforce and labor in a completely different way. I think that the people who are losing their jobs that were those 9 to 5, 40-hour week or longer jobs in factories and manufacturing, those jobs, to your point, probably aren't coming back, but people can cobble together a really nice income with more flexibility in the gig economy. I think that's one. Again, not a silver bullet whatsoever, but also with the loss of these jobs comes new jobs. So because you offshore something and you create products, whether it's the iPhone or anything else, one thing that you start to have within the United States, because we're still the largest consumer of these goods, is a logistics industry. So one thing that we're seeing growing very rapidly are logistics jobs, which are high-paying jobs, which are good quality jobs, because you have to be able to transport these materials from the ports typically inland to various communities. I would say my third point on this is to look at the future of big companies and the technology industry, which is really just at its infancy stage. Amazon just a couple of weeks ago announced that it's going to have a headquarters number 2 in the United States or in North America somewhere, which will be 50,000 new jobs with the average income for those wage earners of $100,000 a year. That's completely transformational in whatever community it lands in. I'm hoping it lands somewhere in Southern California, but I'm biased. But the reality is we're seeing more and more of that. So while we're losing some of the traditional jobs that you hear so much about people wanting to preserve or bring back, to your point, I'm not sure they're going to come back. But the good thing is that new opportunities are arising because of the advent of technology and because we're still going to have to service those goods coming back to the U.S.
So policymakers have sold the middle class out in exchange for people being able to buy a $10 fan at Walmart. These jobs that we have outsourced and sent overseas, as cheap as goods are, you will never make up that salary that those American workers lost. No matter how cheap something might feel, I would rather, it's the old Henry Ford saying, why do you pay your employees so much? Well, so they can afford to buy a Ford. These jobs, I think it's terrible what we've done. I think if a manufacturer makes something overseas with slave labor or $1 a day labor, $5 a day labor, we should slap a tariff on it. We should go back to the earlier days in our country. I know I've seemed like the free tradist for a lot of things I've said up here, but there's a lot of Democrats who believe in tariffs too, and a lot of the working class believes in this too. And I want to point out, for the first 120 years of our country, the only taxes, our entire federal government survived on three. It was tariffs on imported goods, it was a sin tax on alcohol and things like that, and it was a tax on inheritances. For the first 120 years of our nation's existence, we need to take a page back from that. We need to go back to tariffs.
David Hadley, you've been waiting so patiently.
I'm trying. This is a complex problem, and there is technology advancements, and there's offshoring, and all these things that the other panelists have described. But I want to leave you with one statistic on this, which is just damning of California policy. California is over 10% of the population of the United States. It's over 10% of the GNP of the United States. California, for the last 10 years, has gotten less than 2% of the manufacturing investment that has been made in the United States. So you can talk about global forces all you want, but many of the challenges to middle class opportunities and jobs in these sectors are made in California. They're made in Sacramento.
All right, time for another question from our audience. I think we might have time for...
I saw someone had their hand raised over there.
Oh, yeah. Well, I had a question about globalization, but I think you guys pretty much already answered it. But I can say it anyway. So I think you guys talked about a lot of really good economic indicators. So my question was, to what extent do you think globalization has shrunk the middle class, and what do you think are economic solutions to that? You guys talked about the gig economy, and Trump has said tariffs and protectionist things, but
so is Bernie Sanders, by the way, just for the record.
Yeah, so if you had anything else to add to that, but you guys did kind of answer it. So
I will wade in with a countercultural 2017 defense of globalization. The world does not owe the United States a middle-class living. It is incumbent upon us, both as citizens and as residents and as parents, to create it for ourselves and our children through education and good behavior and investment in our own futures. But it's incumbent upon us to be productive enough and competitive enough to earn a middle-class living. I would have to disagree with my colleague Mike that you can dismiss a cheap fan, a cheap Walmart fan as never worth the cost. Our middle class living has been built in no small degree on affordable goods, on affordable food, on affordable clothing. It is the most regulated and the most state-run sectors of our economy, education, healthcare, and so on, where prices do not fall, where innovation is not allowed to bring better solutions, not only for middle class and high-earning jobs, but also for better goods and services for the public.
So the world does not owe us in the United States a middle-class existence. I don't think that there's a panel in Indonesia right now or any of the other countries that compete with us thinking about how they could make the American middle class better. But I'll tell you who owes us a middle-class existence, and that is our policymakers. The people making these decisions, largely in Washington, D.C., they do owe Americans a middle-class existence. They can do things to make our middle class better. And I think this idea of entering into trade agreements, the American worker will never compete with $5 a day labor. I have a friend who's now in the Assembly. He's now in the Senate. He opened up a solar company, and they had an office. They opened up one in Wales and one in China. At Wales, everybody was drinking, having a good time. This is great. You brought these jobs here. In China, on day one, they said everyone was. It was like you could hear a pin drop. Everyone was really sad. And they went around and they asked the workers, well, why are you so sad? We just opened up this thing. They said, well, we just heard that Indonesia has lowered their wage from $5 a day to $3 a day, and we're worried that you're going to outsource us. So, I mean, it's a race to the bottom, folks. If you allow it to be that we allow goods in our country that are paid for by slave wages, the American worker will always lose, period, the end.
I have to disagree and agree with Brian and David. I think it's globalization is much like technology. Some people lose, some people gain, and it's not clear at all that the net effect is negative, and that's something we should fight. I think no one here would think, oh, we shouldn't use technology. We should go back to how we produced goods like 20 years ago, because some people are losing their jobs because of that. I think it's a force that it's stronger than that. I think and I agree with Brian when he says that we really should. There are some people who lose, but there are actually a lot of good things that come with it. And I think the discussion should be, what's the net effect of that, and how can we then help the workers who lose find other jobs or retrain themselves and find jobs where they can, have skills that complement technology or complement globalization better.
And I just want to add. So obviously, big proponent of globalization, and actually, I'm again my progressive stripes. I'm a big open borders person, and I think that that's in line with kind of the tech community in the Silicon Valley. But I'm actually on your side in the sense that I don't know that I don't support necessarily tariffs on companies who use, as you term it, slave labor. However, I do think it's incumbent upon journalists like me and like you, and all of us who are activists and all of us who are simultaneously content producers and consumers with social media accounts to make this information public, because I think it's atrocious. Even though it's really good for the people who are in China who are like, oh, we finally have a job, even if it's $5 a day, I think that the more public awareness there is, the more likely that someone like me or you in this room is going to say, now that I have the information about how these workers are treated in another country, I'm not going to buy that product anymore until they do something. And I think that's the real way to change it, and which completely changes the dynamics. I'm not sure that the Trump or Sanders approach of tariffs is a good one. I think it's a bad one, actually. But I do think that what is good is making and building awareness around this type of labor being used, and then we as consumers and as a society say, that's not acceptable no matter where it is, we're not buying that product. And you see, when that happens, companies react a lot faster than when a government policy takes effect.
So again, ladies and gentlemen, the question tonight is, do we need more government involvement to save the middle class from disappearing? Before our discussion and debate, a whole lot of people said yes. One person said no. You'll have the chance to weigh in on that again. Hopefully, some minds out there have been swayed, because we've heard a number of compelling arguments this evening. And for that, I'd like to thank all four of our panelists, Brian Calle, Mike Gatto, Silvia Barcellos, and David Hadley. Thank you all so much for taking the time.